For today's video, I am once again going to probably get myself in trouble, depending on how big this channel is, as I want to talk about my problems with fandom when it comes to covering the game industry. I'm going to be getting into double trouble with this video, as right now as I'm recording it, the San Diego Comic-Con event is going on, where all matter of pop culture tends to coalesce into this massive ball of fandom. But over here on the East Coast, there's a video game convention going to be coming up in about a week or so in New Jersey, and I went there last year, got to meet a few people in the game industry, gave exchange cards, just kind of was like my first experience there. I was planning on going back there this year. I sent them a few emails about doing stuff and they never got back to me. So I decided to look at who they have presenting, or the major people going to be at this year's event. And the list includes a YouTuber, a cosplayer, an actress, and plenty of DJs. Not just one, there's multiple ones there. There's just one thing missing from this list: people who are actually making video games for a living, or who have been in the industry. And it kind of gave me the motivation for our video today, and that is talking about kind of my issues with fandom, and how it's taken over a lot of conversations about game development. Now, as we've said in previous pieces, the video game industry on the game journalistic side grew up from fans wanting to talk to fans about video games. And back during the late 80s and 90s, again, there was no such thing as seeing video games being this juggernaut that took over. Again, it wasn't until about the end of last decade that even colleges started to begin to accept or have game design or video game degrees and programs. And the fandom has certainly kept things alive, and has kept things growing as well. And as we know, there are plenty of video games out there that have definitely survived and thrived thanks to the overwhelming support of their fandom, such as that little game called Diablo 3 over there, Mario, Final Fantasy, Metal Gear, you name it. And we've talked about the double-edged sword of fandom in previous videos. But for today, when I think about how fandom has taken over the conversation, it has in a way, it has annoyed me, because it makes my job a lot harder to do. When we look at kind of the state of video game pieces and people covering games for a living, be it on major sites, on YouTube, Twitch, you name it, most of them don't really have game development qualifications. I used to, when I really wanted to hurt myself, read the profile or the bio pages of writers and people on major game sites. And the majority of them just never really stood out in terms of game development. There are people who say, I'm a professional at video games because I cosplay as all my favorite anime characters. Or someone saying, I'm a video game expert because I have 600 hours in Skyrim or Fallout. And a few of you probably right now are chuckling. I can already hazard a guess as to which ones are doing that. But when I look at what kind of passes off as game journalism and the people covering them, it all seems to devolve into fans talking about other fan topics with other fans, and it just so happens to include video games. And I'm just not sure if a lot of the people who are considered the heights of game journalism can actually talk about game development. And that comes off, I think, way more insulting than I intended it to. But again, when we look at what it means again in the game industry, anyone who's trying to learn game development or understand what it means to make a video game, most of the major sites out there, I think actually all of them, are pretty much useless in that regard. Because listening to fans talk about how much they love their fan games doesn't exactly prepare you if you want to try and make something for a living. And this has become, in many ways, the standard for what video games have become. What game journalism and game coverage has become. That the only people who do rise up are the ones who are the biggest fans, outs or regardless of their actual experience or understanding of the industry. And you can see this on everywhere from major sites to even that show Player Select on Disney XD, that just shows a bunch of big name YouTubers, commenting and making weird faces and yelling about video games. And like I said a few minutes ago, there's nothing inherently wrong with having fans cover games like that. But when that becomes the accepted and only standard, it makes it very hard to have serious discussions and professional ones about what it means to make game development. So we're going to switch to some game footage in a minute, but before we do that, I'm going to go on a very big, analogy rant here. So here it goes. When I think about kind of what I want game journalism to be versus what it is now, it always seems to be kind of like the difference between someone like Les Stroud of Survivor Man versus Bear Grylls of Man vs. Wild. And I know that is a tangent for the video here. But if you don't know who those two people are, Bear Grylls is a survivalist who does the show Man vs. Wild. It's a over-the-top take on survival. He's the kind of person, and I'm sorry about that ad popping up in the middle of my own thing over there, but he is the person who covers survival kind of from more the extreme side of things. Like, he's the one who will show you the most over-the-top way of getting through a situation. There are also certain calls and claims that he wasn't doing things legitimately, or he had a team or was being staged or exaggerated. Les Stroud of Survivor Man, his shows were a lot more slower pace. It would just be him in the wilderness surviving. And he never took insane chances or did anything too extreme because he was literally surviving. One of those shows is a lot more interesting to watch than the other. But one of those shows is also a lot more informative and more realistic than the other. And I always like to say, or I always like to equate myself to being more on that Survivor Man style, outside of having no experience playing the harmonica. But we're going to take a quick Patreon supporter and sponsor shout out, and when we return, we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of when fandom has gone over the top and what happens when developers get caught in the crossfire of it. And now a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom Patreon supporters and sponsors. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. As we said in the last section, fandom has certainly become a double-edged sword for when it comes to covering video games and even just any kind of pop culture, where the fans become gatekeepers or just simply becoming the people who will yell and scream if they don't get their way for any chosen property. There are some discussions about Pokemon with the upcoming game regarding what Pokemon will be in it. We have situations such as with Undertale in the past, with the fandom getting very vitriolic about any kind of discussions or people from the outside criticizing the game. And again, it's always been a very tricky balance when it comes to the fans of any chosen property. But this does raise a very tricky question when it comes to game coverage. And I know this is something that we've talked about. I don't know if we've said this either privately on our Discord channel, or I may have just had a discussion about this with someone. And that has to do with who do you get to look at a big name video game? Do you get somebody who is the hardest of the hardcore fan to write a review? Or do you get somebody who is a professional but may not be as experienced with that chosen game? And this is one of those questions that, for a lot of people watching this right now, they will quickly either answer yay or nay to it, or professional versus the fan. But when we think about it, it's a lot harder of a question to answer than you might realize. Getting a hardcore fan to review a game means that you're getting somebody who's already going into this without that outsider's experience. That if there are any problems with the game, it's going to be very hard for them to actually mention them, or they may not even consider them to be problems anymore. And again, this gets back to that situation of fans just talking about fans about their favorite games. Now, the other situation, if you get the professional, somebody who isn't as well versed in the game but knows about video games in general or at a higher level, then you're going to get somebody who's going to write a more measured review but may not necessarily hit or understand the major beats of what makes that game successful. This is kind of the situation where we ran into that whole Dean Takahashi Cuphead scenario. That people were arguing and yelling about him trying to review that game or cover it when he was making incredibly beginner level mistakes at the 2D platforming. But he has an experience when it comes to covering video games as a whole. And again, it's very hard when we talk about video games like this because video games are not the same as other pop culture products or properties like TV, film, comic books, and whatnot. You can watch a TV show and experience it the same way whether you've never watched any episodes of that show or if you are a binge-watching super hardcore fan. But when it comes to video games, if you are not at least somewhat versed in that genre or that game design, your experience with that game is not going to be as accurate as somebody who knows what's going on. There is the famous IGN God Hand review, where the reviewer, not understanding how that game worked, gave it, I think it was like a 2 or 3 out of 10. And people to this day still call out IGN for that review, including yours truly. But again, with that kind of situation, is that review valid if it comes from somebody who's never played that game before? For instance, if you give somebody who's never played XCOM a copy of XCOM 2 and tell them to play on the hardest core difficulty, chances are they are going to despise that game. The same goes for throwing somebody blind into a Souls-like who has had no action-adventure or RPG experience. And this, again, is a very tricky topic when we talk about, again, the intersection between fans and coverage of these titles. That the very best people are those who are able to take a somewhat measured response to it. Again, we can't say 100% objective. Even with the stuff that I cover and I talk about, I try to stay as non-biased as possible. But even with that said, though, that's not possible. When I play a platformer, I'm approaching that as somebody who has played hundreds of platformers in my time. If I switch gears and start playing a Skyrim or The Witcher, I don't have that much experience in those genres. So any attempts at fandom or caring about the major characters, that doesn't interest me. It's not part of my conversation. So if somebody is trying to read a review and wants to know whether or not the story does Geralt justice or what happens to Yennefer or any of those other characters, you're not going to find out in my review of that game. And again, it all goes back, I think, to what do you, as in the viewers watching this right now, and what does the audience of people caring about video games want to hear about when it comes to game coverage? Do you just want fans talking about their fan loves of their fan games? Or do you want somebody to take a hard look at a game, who may decry a game like Dark Souls for being too difficult? Or somebody who's going to argue that maybe Mass Effect or any of the BioWare games weren't as good as people said they were? Again, it's one of those very tough things to talk about, and I'm sure for a few of you watching this right now, and when I think about this, I think the segue is going to come, or the seg will come in between people who want to just play video games for a living versus people who want to develop games for a living. Because, as we all know, for people who are in game dev, we don't necessarily have the time to play tons and tons of video games. And when you start looking at games at that high level, you don't care about somebody's favorite fan theories of Undertale, or how the best cosplayers of Blizzard games got their costumes together. You probably care more about why people still love Blizzard's games, Or what was the interesting aspects of the morality systems in a game like Undertale, and how were they conceived? And when we talk about games like that, however, it is a more niche topic when it comes to video games. Because as we've said, fandom has kind of come to dominate the conversation. But with that said, my final question for everyone watching is, I guess, where do you see the discussion of game development going in the next 5 to 10 years? Do you think we will actually have kind of like the PBS or the NPR of game dev? Or do you think it's going to still be kind of a fans talking to fans only kind of affair? But let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of interesting ones with this piece. And thank you so much for watching. Be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we simply are in science of games. Until next time, have a great night. If you're looking for a book on design, my first title, 20 Essential Games to Study, is out now. It is available where most books are sold, and it comes in paper, hardcover, or digital copies. This is the perfect book for anyone interested in learning about game design, whether you are a student, enthusiast, or just a fan. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.